Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to today's webinar on ethnicity pay reporting. I'm delighted to say today I'm joined by Verity Davidge. Verity is Head of Education and Skills Policy. Working alongside the Director of Employment and Skills Policy, Verity is responsible for developing EEF skills, education and employment policy. She responds to government consultation and inquiries on employment skills and education issues. She also supports EEF's National Employment and Skills Policy Committee, as well as leading a number of EEF's regional skills groups. Verity regularly appears in print media, where she writes about why it's important that manufacturers have access to the right quality and quantity of skills. And she's also the co-author of a number of reports, including EEF Skills for Growth, Upskill Battle, Lifting the Lid on the Levy, and Making Migration Work for Manufacturers report. Verity has represented the views of manufacturers at a number of high-level stakeholder groups, including the Home Office Employer Representative Group on EU migration, and DFE Apprenticeship Levy Transfers Group, and she's also represented EF at all-party parliamentary and parliamentary select committee hearings. Okay, just before I hand you over to Verity, some general housekeepings on today's webinar. Your lines are on mute. There's quite a few of us on the session. So if you have any questions, please direct them via the questions or the chat box, which you can see in the corner of your screen. We've got a few minutes as well at the end, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. Today's webinar has been recorded, I should say, and a copy of that recording will be made available afterwards. And there's also a number of polling questions throughout, and I'd encourage you to take part in these. So without further delay, I'll hand you over to Verity.
Thanks, Roger, and welcome to everyone on today's webinar covering ethnicity pay reporting. So a look today at the agenda. We're going to kick off with the background to ethnicity pay reporting. We're going to look at what is being proposed, who should report and by when, what support might employers need. We're going to have a bit of a look at what else is in store for employment law for the remainder of the year and to look into next year. And finally, as Roger mentioned, we'll have some time for some questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, let's look at the background to ethnicity pay reporting. So back in 2016, the government asked Baroness McGregor-Smith to examine the barriers faced by people from ethnic minorities in the workplace and consider what could be done to address them. In 2017, the Baroness published her report called Race in the Workplace, which set out a range of actions for businesses and government to take forward to improve both the employment and career prospects for those from ethnic minority groups. And one of these recommendations was that the government should legislate for mandatory reporting of ethnicity pay data, with her recommending that this should be done by £20,000 pay bands. Now, at this point back in 2016, the government suggested that a mandatory approach shouldn't be taken, and instead we should adopt a voluntary approach. This was very similar to the stance we had on gender pay gap reporting. A voluntary approach was first suggested, and we had Think Act report, but then limited action was taken, so the government took a mandatory approach instead. So 1 year on from the report in 2017, it, just like gender pay gap reporting, found really limited progress had been made. In fact, just 11% of employees reported that their organisations collected data on ethnicity pay, and this fell to 8% for smaller organisations. So in light of that, the government is now consulting on a mandatory approach. And the consultation, which is open right now, will close on the 11th of January 2019, with EF submitting a response. So a lot of the feedback and the results from the polling questions that you gave us today will really feed into our submission to make sure your views are held to government. It's also worth noting that this was also a Conservative manifesto, so to build on the gender pay gap reporting and extend to ethnicity. And whilst this consultation has taken some while to appear, for me, I've been waiting for it for almost a year, I think it is at the point now where we won't be seeing it pushed back, and it will definitely go forward. However, there are a number of key questions, such as timing and when we will have to report, which we're going to cover up today. So let's look at some of the drivers of ethnic pay disparities. One of the key drivers is actually occupations. So ethnic minorities, in particular, people from Bangladeshi and Pakistani backgrounds, tend to work in low-skilled and therefore lower-paid roles. And for that reason, that's why we have a bit of a pay gap. Interestingly, on the other hand, those from an Indian ethnic group, for example, are actually more likely to work in higher-skilled occupations. And if we now look at the chart on the screen, which I'll bring up now, this really shows all the various variations of the ethnicity pay disparities. So as I mentioned before, those from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds tend to work in elementary and sales and consumer service roles. And these are termed low-skilled and lower middle-skilled roles associated with lower pay. But then when we look to Indian employees, you can see that a very high proportion are working in managerial, director and professional roles.
Verity, thanks for that. There's just the first questions come in, and it's around about ethnicity pay benchmarking reports that currently exist. So I think someone's asking here, are there any existing pay benchmarking reports or any data around the current gap?
That's an interesting question, because with gender pay gap reporting, we always had the ONS gender pay gap data, which was captured in what's called the annual survey of hours and earnings. We don't have the exact same on ethnicity pay, but there is some data from the Labour Force survey, which the ONS publishes, which shows a pay gap. We're also going to come onto the webinar looking at some of the examples, some best practice examples from companies who have already published this data. So I hope that will be of use.
Thanks, Verity.
So occupations isn't the only driver. There are a myriad of factors, really. If we look then to progression, only 12%, over 12% of the working age population are from ethnic minority backgrounds, yet they only make up 10% of the workforce. And when we look at those top management positions, it's just 6%. So in a very similar way to gender pay gap reporting. Age is also a factor. So ethnic minority groups in the workforce are on average younger than white British people. Therefore, we might expect pay to be slightly lower simply due to age. On education, ethnic minority groups do actually have higher level qualifications than white British people. However, there are suggestions of underused talent. So they might have a higher level qualification, but actually be in a slightly lower level role. Gender again plays a part, with some evidence to suggest a double disadvantage may actually exist for some groups of ethnic minority women. And finally, discrimination and bias. So one of the kind of key things that the McGregor-Smith report noted was that even when overt discrimination might not be present, there remains this lingering bias within the system which continues to disadvantage certain groups. And this is very much around that recruitment idea that we often tend to recruit people just like us. And it's a myriad of these factors that overall play into the wider ethnicity pay gap. So let's look now to what's actually being proposed in the government's consultation. And I should add at this point that this is just a very initial consultation, so it's very high level for now. We'd expect, as this proposal goes forward, to then have further consultations with a lot more detail. But what the consultation document does suggest is a number of approaches that could be taken on ethnicity pay information which should be reported. And we'll take a look at those one by one now. So option A would be to have one overall pay gap figure comparing average hourly earnings of all ethnic minority employees as a percentage of white employees. And this would be in this very similar vein as the current gender pay gap comparing men and women. Slightly more complicated or a little bit more detailed, option B would be to have several pay figures comparing average hourly earnings of different groups of ethnic minorities as a percentage of white employees. Now, when we talk about several, we're yet to determine how many that would be. I'll come on to on the next slide the fact that there are actually up to 18 different definitions of ethnicity. Option C would be ethnicity pay information showing the proportion of employees from different ethnic groups by £20,000 pay bands. And the reason why this is the option is because there was the Baroness McGregor Smith's original recommendation. So you'd have 0 to £20,000, 20 to £40,000, 40 to £60,000, and so on and so forth. Option D would be to have ethnicity pay information by pay quartile, so very much like one of the metrics of gender pay reporting. There's nothing yet in the consultation to suggest what the breakdown of this might be. E would be to have all of the above, F would be to do something a bit different, or G would be none of the above. And at that point, Roger, I think we have our first polling question.
We do. Cheers. Thanks, Verity. Okay, for those in attendance on the live webinar, the first polling question's up on the screen now. Should ethnicity pay gap reporting mirror the requirements of gender pay gap reporting, e.g. reporting on 6 metrics? Yes, no, or don't know. So should ethnicity pay gap reporting mirror the requirements of gender pay gap reporting? Just a couple of moments left to complete that polling question before I close it. I can see the results coming in now. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to close that and put the results up for us to see. Verity, I don't think you can see the stats, but we've got okay, 65% say yes, 18% no, another 18% are unsure or don't know.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roger. That's really useful. And I think perhaps unsurprising. I imagine many of those dialed in today are those already in scope of gender pay gap reporting who might be expecting to be in scope for ethnicity pay reporting. And I think there is that important element of keeping consistency and making sure that it is as easy as possible to undertake this report. That's also really useful information for us to go to government and make our policy recommendations. So I mentioned earlier that there are a number of classifications when it comes to ethnic groups, and I think it's worth taking a look at some of that detail and also having a bit of a conversation about self-reporting. So some of the potential complexities of ethnicity pay reporting is first that there is no legal obligation currently on employers to collect data on ethnicity. Some of the research carried out by the Equality and Human Rights Commission found that actually 60% of larger employers, so those with over 250 employees, do collect some form of data on ethnicity, but they might not actually link that all up to pay. And that doesn't quite chime with the work from Baroness McGregor Smith, findings from her report in 2016, which I referenced earlier. Now, where employers do actually collect data, some report declaration rates of below 50%. So they might be collecting the data, but the employees themselves aren't completing it. Many report that their workforce expressed concerns about how the data will be used, with just under a third of employers stating that the data was just too intrusive. They didn't actually want to ask those questions. Over a quarter said that employees did not want to share the information, and 1 in 5 said it was just too onerous to do that undertaking. In a similar vein, there is no legal obligation for individuals to disclose which ethnicity group they identify with. So even if the employer collects that information, individuals themselves don't have to disclose. As I've already mentioned, there are a number of classifications. The 2011 ONS census group, individuals can put themselves into one of 18 detailed ethnic groups. They do comprise of 5 broader categories, which are white, Asian, black, mixed and other. However, even within these groups and those 18 groups again, there remain unique cultural differences which really need to be quite clearly defined. Some employees just prefer not to say. Employers might collect the data, but they would rather not disclose it. Analysing data can actually be quite complicated. If we think about those numbers of classifications and then how you report, you can imagine that that could be potentially quite a complex task. Some individuals actually say it's quite difficult because they don't always associate themselves with any of the categories, or they perhaps associate themselves with more than one category. So employers are left with a decision on whether to include all of those, and also to include those who have preferred not to say. To overcome this, some employers who have collected the data already have taken some action to improve self-reporting, and I think that's always useful to know, particularly if we think that those companies on the webinar today might be in scope of ethnicity pay gap reporting. What can you perhaps do now to begin to prepare? So some of the examples that have come up include explaining to employees quite clearly how the data will be used, to build the collection of data into the recruitment process. So, for example, new joiners might be asked to provide it as part of their onboarding process. And finally, just making data collection a little bit more simpler. We have a tendency, particularly in manufacturing, to stick to a lot of hard copies of things. There's no reason that this couldn't actually be done through an online form. I mentioned earlier that it might be quite helpful to look at some of the examples of where organisations have already published their pay reports on ethnicity. And here's an example now from the Greater London Authority. Now, they've taken quite a similar approach as the gender pay gap, looking at both the median and the mean hourly pay, as well as pay quartiles. So you can see that on your screen now. To the left-hand side, we've got the mean and the median pay, and then the pay gaps. And then to the right-hand side, we've also got those pay quartiles. So if you've undertaken gender pay gap reporting, that might look quite familiar to you. Now, whilst the pay quartiles covers white and BAME employers, so they've grouped them together into two, I imagine for ease, they do include some of the headline ethnicity pay data, which is then broken down into the wider categories on the left-hand side. But you'll see the categories that they have used aren't the ONS classifications. It looks like they've used their own classifications. And you can imagine that if a lot of companies started using their own classifications, it might actually be quite difficult to be able to benchmark yourself against others. Here's another example from PwC. They tend to be the earlier adopters of these kinds of things, just in the same approach to gender pay gap reporting, really, in that they report the mean and the median BAME pay gap, the mean and the median bonus pay gap, the percentage of BAME and non-BAME employees receiving a bonus, and then again the pay quartiles. So this pretty much mirrors the gender pay gap reporting with the same number of metrics. This is, however, BAME and non-BAME, as opposed to breaking it down into more detail. I imagine then if we were to apply the same methodology, but for the broader 5 categories or even the 18, that could provide quite complex and a number of metrics having to be reported. The next area that the government is consulting on at this point is on narratives and action plans. For gender pay gap reporting, employers can voluntarily produce an accompanying narrative, and indeed the majority of companies have decided to do this. I think many on today's webinar will agree that narratives are as important as the data itself. And when it came to gender pay, many narratives took a focus on how we can boost the number of young females studying STEM, how we can encourage more women into the industry, and also plans in place for retaining women. So reviewing maternity schemes, introducing mentoring or coaching programs. So we saw quite a lot of action in that space. Government sees narrative plans and action plans are really useful to report on the quality of pay reporting and to drive meaningful action. And always with the point of these things, it is to drive action, it's to drive behaviour. It's not to put an onerous new burden on employers. It's to shine that spotlight to say what are the barriers that ethnic minority groups face in employment, in recruitment and in progression. So the government is looking at the possibility of actually making narratives and action plans mandatory from the start. I do wonder how easy providing a narrative would be for an ethnicity pay. Be really interested in your views here, so do put some comments in our chat box. I think it may depend on which of the options the government opts for. So if you were to supply one overall figure, for example, that may be easy to report, but you'd have to offer quite a lot of detail to the background behind that figure. However, if you published a myriad of figures and you had that breakdown, a narrative might be a little bit easier. But do let us know your thoughts, as that would be really useful feedback. So let's look at now at who should report or who might report and by when, and then we'll look at the kind of support employers might need to make this happen. So the consultation document asks what threshold ethnicity pay reporting should apply to. So how many companies with a set number of employees should be in scope. In her report, Baroness McGregor-Smith recommended a threshold of 50 employees, so a lot lower than gender pay. However, the government has immediately pushed back on this, and in the consultation document instead proposes 250 employees or more. And again, those who are familiar with gender pay gap reporting will know that that would mirror gender pay. However, some employers have actually argued that we could increase the threshold, and that could be actually quite beneficial, as it would lower the chances of employers not being able to publish ethnicity pay data for fear of protecting the identity of their employees. And at that point, Roger, I think we have our second polling question.
We do, thanks Verity. Okay, as mentioned, second polling question's up on the screen now, and it's regarding size of employer and where you think that threshold should be. So what size of employer or employee threshold should be within scope for mandatory ethnicity pay reporting? So more than 50 employees, more than 250 employees, more than 500, or employees, employers of any size. So just a couple of moments to see that polling question. I can see the results coming through. We definitely have a clear winner, Verity, or it looks like we have a clear winner. Just a couple of moments to collect those responses. Okay, thanks for that. I'll close the poll and share them. Probably no surprises, Verity, but 51% of people think that it should be more than 250 employees, obviously copying the gender pay gap reporting, 8% for more than 50, 22% for more than 500, and 19% employers of any size. So that's 51%, the majority, more than 250 employees.
Thanks, Roger. And I know from us doing webinars on gender pay gap reporting, that probably didn't come much to a surprise to you. Again, if the earlier poll suggested that companies wanted to mirror the metrics, I think it would make sense that over half of those on today's webinar want to mirror the threshold. I think quite two interesting ones actually are the more than 500 employees. That's something we've had from a lot of companies, particularly those who are in, I think, that 250 to 500 range, who might be wondering that if they have to then break down the data into 5 categories or 18, that might begin to kind of identify their employees in those groups. So I think it really depends on the methodology that the government takes. And then, of course, 1 in 5 of you think that employers of any size. So that's interesting again. Again, I think we might see in the future maybe gender pay gap reporting being cascaded down. So who knows, I think we need to watch that space with that one. So one of the big questions that we've had to date has been, when would employers in scope actually have to report? And this isn't really covered in great detail within the consultation. There is no suggestion to say that it will be coming in any day now. Instead, the suggestion is really that the government works with early adopters, so the likes of Greater London Authority and PwC, as we've seen previously, across both the public and the private sector, so to test the approaches before mandatory reporting is required. So it could be that we see testing of a certain methodology, but then if those pilots don't work, maybe we change it to something else. And in terms of timelines, if you are beginning to panic and think you need to go away and change your software systems and start collecting that data, let's just remind ourselves that from the time the government mooted gender pay to the time then we had to undertake the first report and publish the first report, we probably had about 4 years. So I think with any of these new initiatives or policy frameworks that come in place, we generally have a little bit of time to prepare, and we will definitely be pushing that message to government, particularly because we know that so many employers don't currently hold that information, so a lot of preparatory work will need to be undertaken. And then at that point, we have our third polling question.
We do. Thanks, Verity. Okay, third polling question's up on the screen now. Thinking about ethnicity pay gap reporting, which of the following statements, if any, do you agree with? Okay, so a bit of reading on this one. I'm concerned about the time and resource it will take. It's a good opportunity to benchmark ourselves against others. My company does not have data on ethnicity of our workforce. Reporting will be easier after undertaking gender pay gap reporting, or you could be concerned that it could lead to individual employees being identified. I'll give it a little while to collect those responses, and just multiple responses, or more than one if you think it's applicable, just so we get a good feel for thoughts really on ethnicity pay gap reporting. Okay, I can see there's a decent spread of responses coming through, with perhaps no overly sort of strong winner here, Verity, but give it a couple of moments before I close the poll. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to close that poll and I'm going to share the results up on the screen so we can see. Okay, Verity. 57% is the strongest. It's a good opportunity to benchmark ourselves against others, so seeing it in a positive light there. 51% are concerned about the time and resource it will take. 46% company does not have data on ethnicity of our workforce. 27% saying reporting will be easier after undertaking gender pay gap. And 35% it could lead to individual employees being identified. So perhaps the story there is people are concerned about the time and resource, and others seeing it's a good opportunity to benchmark themselves.
Yes, I think there's definitely some good news story in that. I'm really positive that over half of the respondents today said it's a good opportunity to benchmark ourselves, because we also saw that with gender pay. And actually to do that, we recently published a report, Making Gender Pay Manufacturers Business, where companies in manufacturing can actually see how they compare to others. So we do download and work that data out for you. I think we're not surprised about the potential for it to take a lot of time and resource, particularly if 46% don't currently have that information on ethnicity. But it's good to know that it might be a bit easier if you've undertaken gender pay gap reporting, and particularly if we pitch to government that actually we should be mirroring the approach as possible. We know that there is some fear about individual employees being identified. We had a lot of conversation with those around gender pay, and generally we didn't have that same breakdown and potential small sample size. So all of that feedback we will be taking back to government and policymakers to make sure that they know about some of the concerns and that we can come up with solutions to address those. So thinking about some of those challenges, we'd really like to know what support you might need, and government is really keen to know what employers' support they may need to make this work. So the government is really looking for ideas of the sort of support companies want. This could be guidance, it could be toolkits, best practice case studies, or examples of those early adopters as we've seen previously. What works well for your business. We're really keen to ensure that we learn lessons from gender pay gap reporting. We know there are a number of grey areas that still remain, even with the ACAS guidance, because it never quite covers every eventuality and every individual circumstance. So interested in your thoughts via the chat box. Is ACAS the kind of go-to for guidance? And then really interested in what EF can do to support you. So on that note, Roger, let's have our final polling question.
Thanks, Verity. Okay, final polling question is up on the screen. Well, it will be up on the screen as soon as I can press the button. It is up on the screen now. Okay, and it's what supports would help your company prepare for ethnicity pay gap reporting? So what support would help your company prepare for ethnicity pay gap reporting. In-house training for your HR team, your senior managers, preparing calculations for ethnicity pay reports, some e-learning perhaps on preparing ethnicity reports, ACAS guidance or similar to that of gender pay gap reporting, or a toolkit or publication on how to prepare a report. So just a few moments there for a sort of market researchy question, I guess, to see what the preferences are out there. Okay, thanks for participating in that polling question. I'll close the poll and share the results up on the screen. 86% Verity prefer some sort of toolkit on how to prepare a report. It's a good broad mix here, actually. 73% e-learning, 76% some help in preparing calculations. Only 43% I think are saying in-house training, and 68% ACAS guidance, similar to that of gender pay gap reporting.
Yeah, I think that's a good spread, good different methods of learning and preparing. It's definitely something EF will take on board in terms of our service that we deliver to members, and also really useful to know that over 2/3 of companies still really use the ACAS guidance. We work really closely with ACAS when they are preparing the guidance to try to cover all of the kind of nuances, particularly in manufacturing and engineering, where we know there are many pay elements, to give you as many examples and got clear guidance as possible. So I would say that as this policy unfolds, watch this space and we will be supporting you every step of the way. So that's it really on ethnicity pay reporting, but for those of you who have remained on the webinar, we have a little bonus for you in that we're going to look at what else is in store for employment law. So first off, the Home Office white paper on the future migration system. So that's what the future migration system will look like after December 2020 is due any day now. And a bit like the ethnicity pay consultation, this is one we've been waiting for a good 12 months. Now I say any day now, but we now have been told that it's not actually due to come out until after the Brexit meaningful vote on the 11th of December. Also waiting in the wings before Christmas, an early Christmas present to us and to you, will be the government's response to the Taylor Review consultations. And for those of you who remember, this will include the consultation on agency workers, which we know a lot of companies use. Spring sees some big ticket items too next year. We will have the launch of the EU settlement scheme. Now that is the scheme for EU nationals in the UK now, or those that will arrive before December 2020 and they wish to stay in the UK. They will either need to apply for settled status or pre-settled status. This will actually come before the UK leaves the EU on the 29th of March 2019. I'm sure you've got that date in the diary, but if not, add it in. Moving from Brexit to apprenticeships, probably the two things that keep us and manufacturers busy right now. We will have further details on some of the budget announcements. So this includes the announcement that the co-investment rate, that is the amount a non-levy paying company pays towards the cost of apprenticeship training, will halve from 10% to 5%. And in the spring we will be told when this new rule will take place. There's also something for levy paying employers too. From April 2019, they'll be able to transfer up to 25% of their unused levy funds to other employers. We did a webinar recently with the ESFA on this, so if you would like to learn how you can transfer those unused funds, do let us know and we can send those details to you to watch that webinar again. April being a common commencement date sees the increases to the national living wage as well as other minimum wage rates. It also sees increases to auto-enrolment, so 3% for employers and 5% for employees. And of course, the deadline for the second gender pay gap report. So it'll be interesting to see whether we have begun to close the gap in manufacturing and engineering and whether those action plans have been successful. Looking to 2020, we have a couple of things on the horizon. We have parental bereavement leave and pay. And of course, 31st of December, 2020, Happy New Year. It is the end of the transition period. unless, of course, it is extended as per the withdrawal agreement allows. So a lot to keep you guys and us guys busy. Now, Roger, I think we've got some time for questions before we close today's webinar.
We do.
So do let me know if any have come in.
We do. Thanks for that, Verity. I'll let you get your breath back. As Verity mentioned, time for some questions at the end. I see we've got some come through already. Just while you're sending the questions through, probably a poignant moment just to remind everyone we have some upcoming seminars and events. So in January, we're extending our popular Practical GDPR for HR Professionals seminar that's running up and down the country, I know. In February also, gender pay gap reporting, lessons learned and next steps. So that's also running, our HR and legal team are running those seminars up and down the country. Also, it's remiss of me not to mention the National Manufacturing Conference taking place on the 19th of February. So for any more information about those events, I'll post some links into the chat box, but also visit website, speak to your EF advisor. We're happy to give you more information on that. Okay, Verity, back to some questions that we've got coming in. Someone's obviously concerned about more reporting here, but do we expect any further mandatory reporting requirements in the future?
I think that's a really good question. I think overall the direction of travel from government is actually towards greater pay transparency. So, for example, right now, FTSE 100 companies with more than 250 employees will soon need to publish the pay ratio between CEOs and average workers. So you could possibly see this cascading down to other companies of different sizes in the future. I think the other area to watch is around disability reporting, not particularly around pay, but just in terms of employment of employees with disabilities. We know that the Equality and Human Rights Commission and certain parliamentary select committees have recommended this and are pushing government on this. So I think it's an area we could potentially see government consult on in the future.
Thanks, Verity. Okay, we've got a question here. So I've just posted in the details and links to those seminars in the chat box too. There's a question here, Verity. Let me just see if I can. Okay, do we know if there's a requirement for employers with less than 250 employees to report on gender pay?
So as of yet, no. It's still the case that only those with 250 employees are in scope. Again, I think it's something that might get pushed in the future. I think if we see the second report and we see progress is made, the government may want to have a conversation about broadening it up. And as I mentioned earlier, there's quite a lot of pressure from select committees and think tanks and other organisations that want to see further action in this space. I think another area which I saw was, further breakdown by age. So we know gender pay gap reporting is particularly high, the gender pay gap is particularly high between the ages of 30 and 49, where women tend to have children, so whether there would be further breakdown. So right now the answer is no, but I would imagine it's something that might be a conversation in the future.
Okay, thanks, Verity. Probably timely to remind folks that that's also a subject EF can help you with. So if it's gender pay gap reporting something you're looking for assistance with, then please do get in touch with EF advisor. Okay, there's a question here, and it's regarding transferring 25% of our levy funds, and someone's wanted more information. Just to answer that, we will be able to supply more information around that. So I think we'll probably want to pick up offline. Okay, Verity, you mentioned settled status for EU nationals. I don't know if it's worth mentioning the Brexit Toolkit and Brexit Hub. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yep, so EF now has a dedicated Brexit Hub where we hold lots of information, such as summaries on the technical notices in the event of a no deal. And we've just launched a Brexit Toolkit. That includes a trade element, and also, if there are a lot of HR on today's webinar, which I expect to be the case, a migration element. Now, on the migration part of the toolkit, there's quite an extensive list of FAQs, which we continue to update. There's some at-a-glance documents that cover key areas, such as what impact does posting workers have to other EU member states have on my employee's ability to apply for settled status. And perhaps most importantly, it takes you through a number of questions for you as an EU national, your employees, to determine at what point you would be eligible for settled status or pre-settled status, and then what next steps you can take to apply. So I think we'll definitely be circulating those details after the webinar, and I can see actually that Roger has posted them now. Really worth having a look, and I think it does pretty much cover every question that you may have. If not, do let us know, because we like to be set a challenge.
Thanks, Verity. That is indeed a challenge. We're just about up for our allotted time for today's session. There's a couple of questions which we haven't managed to get through, which are around GDPR related issues. Probably will require a little bit more in-depth discussion than we've got time for today, but we never like to leave a question unanswered, so we'll come back to you on those issues. So that just leaves me really all left to say thanks, Verity, for your time today, most informative, and thanks everyone for attending, and have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roger.